Hi everyone and welcome to Lesson 7. This lesson is on the subject of what we call syntopical reading, which in our main text for the course, Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, is, according to Adler, the 4th level of reading. This lesson is a very important one in that it situates us in relation to our goals for the second half of the course. So we're a little bit over halfway through Lesson 7 out of 10. But you've just finished, your first final draft of your first major paper for the course, and I've very intentionally divided the course up in this way so that you had worked your way through the third level of reading, analytical reading, in time to do an analytical reading of a story for that first paper. Now, the second half of the course, we're going to move on forward and situate our focus on syntopical reading and learn the strategies for syntopical reading. And in your final assignment, your second major writing project, you'll do more of a syntopical reading, because rather than looking at just one text, you'll look at multiple texts and make connections between them. And another important difference on your second paper is that you'll be able to choose what those texts are rather than working with a specific Poirot story. So this lesson will go over syntopical reading and what Adler has to say about it, some strategies for how to do it, why it's useful. And then in the second half, we will look at a specific story, The Lernaean Hydra by Hercule Poirot, and see how in that story Agatha Christie is inviting us to do some syntopical reading stuff. So that will be our case study for this lecture. And I want to say one more thing about your second writing project before we get into the nitty-gritty of this particular lecture, which is that in the next lecture, Lesson 8, I'll go over the instructions for that writing assignment. And so you'll get a very thorough overview of it, just as you did for the first one, at a similarly well-placed time in the quarter. So that paper will ask you to do some syntopical reading of some different texts. And that's why we're first getting the background on syntopical reading in this lecture. So after this lecture and the next one, you can hit the ground running and start working on your final paper and really be on the home stretch for the course. All right, let's talk about syntopical reading. I picked this visual because it illustrates what syntopical reading is. And if I had to sum up syntopical reading in one phrase or sentence, I would say it's making connections. So you can see in this visual how you have a starting idea, and then you have all of these branches coming out from that starting idea. But you have those branches, if you will, then encircled, and more branches springing off of each of those. So if you trace back to the starting idea, you can see all kinds of connections. And this is what delineates the third and fourth levels of reading. The third level in many ways is the most important. We at least spent the most time on it because that's what you do with an individual text. But the fourth level demands even more of you as a reader and takes you into a realm of reading that will be really useful beyond this class. When you enter the professional world, or even when you're still taking other classes in college, being able to make connections between different ideas is really important. If you're in a science class or a history class or an economics class, you may have to read a bunch of different things, and your professor is going to assume you're going to make connections between them. Similarly, in the professional world, you may have to look at different sources, an email from your boss, maybe some articles or some research on whatever it is you're working with, and figure out how to combine, connect, synthesize, if you will, syntopically read those texts in order to create a presentation or a document, whatever your end product or your composition is. So syntopical reading is incredibly important, and to sum up, it's making connections between different ideas. But before we talk about syntopical reading in more detail, let's recall the other levels of reading. So elementary reading is the ability to read. Inspectional reading is thoughtful, informed skimming. Analytical reading is that close, that deep reading where you really engage with the text and pull it apart and put it back together again. And then syntopical reading is synthesizing multiple perspectives on the same topic. So just take a look at that visual and let it marinate in your mind for a minute. Maybe even pause the lecture. I really like this illustration because it shows how each level is more challenging than the next, more demanding. Remember, we're trying to become demanding readers so that we can become better writers. And I think the one sentence or very short summary of each level here is probably the best summary I've found of each level. So it's just a really helpful illustration for what we've been learning this quarter. And if we take a minute and dwell on the syntopical one, that phrase, synthesizing multiple perspectives on the same topic. If we look at each of those words, I think we see the importance of syntopical reading. So synthesis means to make connections, to bring things together. Synergy is another similar word. That Latin root synth means put together, connect. Multiple, so more than one. Perspective. So what are you synthesizing? What are you connecting or bringing together with syntopical reading? Different points of view on the same topic. We'll talk in just a minute about how we determine if different books or articles or things are written on the same topic. But this is the idea. To sum up, synthesizing multiple perspectives on the same topic. And a question you might have is why? Well, we will answer that through the course of this lecture. But the main reason why is so that you thoroughly understand a subject. Remember in the few lectures ago, we talked about the liberal arts and what that term truly means in the liberal or liberating, freeing aspect of it. It's learning enough about a subject to give your opinion. And that's exactly what I'm going to ask you to do in this final paper. If you can synthesize, syntopically read a few articles on the same subject and understand those different perspectives, bring those perspectives together on the same subject, you are then qualified, entitled to, you have the privilege to give your opinion on that subject, and your thesis for the final paper will be your opinion. That phrase, your opinion, has such a negative connotation in our culture because many people, when they hear the phrase, assume that people haven't done syntopical reading first, that you don't truly understand a subject when they say it's just your opinion. So syntopical reading lets you have an informed topic on a perspective, a trustworthy one that people will trust, which is very crucial to persuading your audience. And that's why syntopical reading will help us reach the top here, the pinnacle of this illustration, which is syntopical writing. And that, in many ways, is the ultimate goal for this course. And for you, before you move on to this course and are done with English courses at EWU, you need to be able to do this syntopical writing. So let's talk about it in more detail. What is syntopical reading? I feel like I've given a few definitions so far, but let's really put it down here, pin it down, clearly define it. Looking at the roots is really helpful. So the Latinate roots here are syn, which means similar. It really should be sint there. I forgot the T. Sint means similar. And then topic, which is subject matter. So syntopical simply means a similar topic or similar subject matter. It's a clever word that Adler came up with that I think really clearly delineates what we do when we reach the highest level of reading and writing, which is synthesize other perspectives and add our own to that conversation. So syntopical means similar topic. In a one-sentence definition from me, this is me putting it in my own words, syntopical reading is the level of reading where you make connections between multiple books or texts. Because Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book is an older text, I still think it's the best one on the subject of close reading, but because it's an older text, he calls everything books. So we're using the term text in this class rather than books to delineate all the things you read and see. books, film, television, music, art, poetry, uh, social media posts, video games. Those are all texts, and you can syntopically read any of them. Now, early in the chapter on syntopical reading, Adler addressed the question of talking, syntopical reading is making connections between two or more books or texts, like we just discussed, on the same subject. How do we decide if texts or books are on the same subject? So he gives us some guidelines, because it's tough to define. He gives us some examples. The novels Gone with the Wind and War and Peace, both very famous, are both novels about war, but they don't have much else in common. So if I were writing about war and I wanted to make a list of the things I needed to read to understand the topic of war, I probably wouldn't go with these two texts. I might pick one of them, but the only thing they really have in common is that they're historical novels. Beyond that, I mean, they deal with completely different wars, and the writing styles are very different. Their countries of origin are different. So that's one illustration. Here's another one. Let's say we were focusing on the Civil War, and so we chose Gone with the Wind. A history book and a novel about the Civil War, like Gone with the Wind, might be too different in genre. So it depends on what we're doing. Some analyses of Gone with the Wind certainly incorporate history. But, if we're doing a literary reading or writing a historical paper or, something else, just because they're both about the Civil War doesn't mean they both work for the same syntopical study. They could. Depends on what the goal, the premise of the study is. But in many cases, they wouldn't. And here's to sum up. So we've seen some examples that don't work for defining the same subject. What does work? How do we actually define the same subject? So ultimately, how we define the same subject has to do with your purposes, what you are studying, the questions you're trying to answer. So in a minute here, we're going to dive into Adler's 5 rules for syntopical reading. But one common thread you'll see in studying syntopical reading is that the focus is all about you. Whereas before, with analytical reading, the focus was all about the book and the author, coming to terms with the author, understanding the author's key terms in order to interpret his or her message. Here it's very different, because the question is, why would you read more than one book? Answering that question is what shifts the focus from the author to you, the reader. You would read more than one book to learn more about the subject. So what are your goals? What do you want to learn about that subject? For what reason? For what purpose? The answers to those questions determine what books or types of books you'll read, and only you can answer those questions. So syntopical reading, in reaching the 4th and highest level of reading, makes this important shift from a focus on the author to a focus on you. And this is very important for this class. I want you to take a minute and think about this, because for the final paper I mentioned a few minutes ago, you will be choosing a subject and you will be researching it. You will be choosing which pieces of research to use. So you'll be, as you read the research to prepare to understand the subject well enough to write on it, you'll be doing the syntopical reading Adler's talking about here. And so how you define your purpose and your goals and what questions you ask, that's all very important to the project you're going to do in a couple weeks, to your research project and your research process. And so with that said, we're going to now go through Adler's 5 rules for syntopical reading and see how they can be useful to you to figure out what to read for your upcoming research project. Right, so these are the 5 rules of the 5 steps in syntopical reading. The first one is finding the relevant passages. So the relevant quotes from what you're reading. You and your concerns are primary. So this is what I just talked about. When you read a book, it's important to find the best quotes, right? That was level 3, analytical reading. But when you're reading a book at level 3, you're reading it to understand its meaning. So there you'd be choosing which quotes are most important to the author. But here, With research, you're working with multiple books on the same topic. Those authors may have conflicting purposes. So since they may have conflicting purposes, since you're looking at 2 or more books, your purposes are central and unified. So your purposes override those and take precedent. And so which quotes you use is up to you. You have that freedom and control here. Now, an important note is you still shouldn't take things out of context. So it's not a question of taking things out of context. It's a question of priority. You can't change the meaning of what an author says, but which things an author says are most important to your purposes. That decision's definitely up to you. The connections you make between texts may be very far from the author's own purposes in composing them. So when an author writes a book or an article or films a movie, whatever the text is, when they create this text, when they compose it, they enter into a conversation. Whatever subject matter it deals with, they're entering into that general discussion of that subject. But as we've seen on the last slide, subjects can be very broad. And so what you choose to read for your understanding of a subject may differ a little bit from what someone else reads. And so you may be reading, say you're researching global warming. You may be reading one book on global warming, and you may be reading another book on global warming. Those 2 authors may not have immediately seen the connection to each other's work. That may not have been part of their goal. But for you to understand global warming better, you need to make that connection. And so, again, you're not changing meaning. You're not taking things out of context. You're just making connections. This text has something else in common with this text. When the author wrote it, he may not have intended for that connection to be there, but it is still there because both books are written on the same subject. Bringing the author to terms. There's authors, plural. That's important. I should have said it the right way the first time. This is important because we talked about coming to terms with an author when we were discussing analytical reading. Right? You remember? So words in the English language are fluid and slippery. So one author may be using a word a different way than another author. And so when you read a text to understand it, you have to understand how the author is using that term, how they're defining the terminology. But with syntopical reading, just as you choose the quotes and you make the connections, you also define the terms. So the authors have to come to terms with you rather than the other way around. This time you bring the authors to terms. So you may have a word that you're defining, and you may be defining it one way. The authors in your study may be defining it a little bit different way. You have to use your definition. And again, you're not changing the meaning of what others say, because your arguments, your ideas can all fit together in the same conversation. You just have to clearly define, how you're defining the words, and what the differences may be, how others are defining them, so that your point is clear. All right, getting the questions clear. These are your questions, but be specific. So I've been framing this conversation in terms of the research process. And when you go to understand a subject better, as you will for the final paper in this class, you have to choose what you're going to read. And one way you do that is by posing questions. You have what we call a research question, what you want to learn by the end of the research process. And so once again, just as you define the terms and choose the passages or quotes, you have to choose the questions. So what do you want to learn by the end of this research process? Now, you decide the question, but the guideline I'll give you for that is to be specific, as this bullet point says. So a great example of like a bad research question is global warming real? Why is that bad? It's very, very general. It's a yes or no question. It leads to binary thinking instead of a well-rounded perspective. So you may be trying to get at something important there, and there is an important significance behind this question, but that won't yield you very good books to read. So you want to ask a better question. So another one might be, what do we need to know about science to understand if global warming is real? So that's a little more complex, a little more nuanced. We have to parse that out more. What do we need to learn to try to answer this more vague question? So you want to ask very specific questions when you go and do your research process and you figure out what books or articles to read. And these are just a couple of examples. I'm sure with whatever you're thinking about writing on, you could think of similar examples. And hopefully these examples will help you figure out how to come up with really good research questions for your own project you're going to start soon. Defining the issues. Group different texts into different categories based on the answers they give to your questions, right? So if you're trying to understand more about global warming, you may get very, very different answers, but some answers may be similar. So say you read 6 articles on global warming. Maybe there's 3 or 4 different perspectives you encounter. You can come up with a name for each of those and then place those articles into that category. And grouping them that way will help you read them more syntopically. It'll help you synthesize the connections between them, because you can say these are the 2 or 3 or 4 main perspectives on this subject, and these articles tend to see it this way, these other articles tend to see it this other way. And so you'll help clearly delineate what you've read and what each piece says and what the similarities and differences are between them. Following along on this train of thought, we have the 5th and final step, which is analyzing the discussion. Once you've got all of the things you're going to read picked out and you've read them, you have to analyze the discussion, or analyze the conversation would be another way to put that. When I talk about some topical reading in the assignment sheet, the writing prompt for your final paper, I use the conversation quite a bit, that the sources, the research you are using, those pieces of writing are having a discussion or a conversation. So you have to analyze it. What are they saying? What are the different points of view? What do they have in common? And that grouping we just talked about for defining the issues can be helpful, because as Adler says, and this is very poignant by him, the conflict of opposing answers might help us find our answer. So if you're researching global warming, you might get a lot of different perspectives. Some of them may even disagree. Some of them may see it as a more real and imminent problem than others. And so you can kind of group those. But just because they take different stances doesn't mean they're not useful. That actually could be very useful, is Adler's point here. So you want to see different perspectives on a topic. If everything you find in your research says the same thing, there's probably only 2 conclusions. Either it's a bad topic, or you haven't found the right research and you need to go back to the drawing board, either get a new topic or find some new pieces of research. So there will be conflicting answers. And to figure out your stance, your opinion, you need to look at those conflicting answers and see, okay, this person's saying this, these other people are mainly saying this. What do I think? What might be a middle ground or a different response? That's where you can step in and do something really productive, really useful with your reading and writing. A couple of other things Adler says before we move on that are really important. On pages 314 to 317 in the book, he talks about remaining objective. This is so very important. You don't want to let your own personal biases come into the syntopical reading process. You may have them, and that's fine. We all do. But you want to stay objective. You want to look at the piece that you're reading and say, does this make an argument? Make a fair argument, a reasonable argument? Does it support that argument well? Does it offer good evidence and proof to support its claims? And that'll help you, like I said before, develop new, balanced, nuanced perspectives on a subject so that you truly are, as we said, learning more about it. because once you learn more about it, you can give your opinion on it. But if you're only reading things that have one perspective and you're bringing your own biases to your analysis of that discussion, you won't be properly trained. You won't be properly liberated to do the kind of free thinking you want to do. You won't know enough. Finally, terminology. On page 324, he points out how an idea can be expressed in more than one set of terms. So this comes back to the idea that for syntopical reading, for your research process, you're defining the terms rather than the author. And so some people will say you can only say something one way. That's not true. There's more than one way to say almost anything. And so you might be using different terms, and that's okay. If, let's say, you're researching global warming, because that's our example, it's just an easy example to use. Say you read 3 articles on it. They might be using different words or phrases to describe the same thing. Maybe you pick one of those phrases to describe the thing. You're using that phrase. You can still bring the articles that use different phrases into the conversation because you're describing the same thing. You're just calling it something different. This is really important to note because you don't want terminology to prevent you from finding the right books to do the research you need to achieve your goals. A couple more notes here, and then we'll move on. The paradox of syntopical reading. He says, unless you know what books to read, you cannot read syntopically. But unless you can read syntopically, you don't know what books to read. So in other words, if you're researching something like global warming, how do you know which articles are the best ones to read? You probably have to do some reading to figure that out. Doesn't that seem paradoxical? Isn't that like an oxymoron or a conflict? Well, sort of. It's a paradox. But a paradox isn't necessarily a bad thing. A paradox can be a beautiful thing. A conflict is where you have 2 opposing ideas, like the ideas here, that are fighting each other. But a paradox is something beautiful. A paradox is where you have 2 opposing ideas that are existing side by side without really fighting or struggling, which is what the paradox of syntopical reading is. Think about it this way. You have to read some about global warming to know what to truly read. But that's okay. That's where the other levels of reading can come into play. Say, for instance, inspectional reading. Say you find 100 articles on global warming, but you only really need to read 5 of them. Well, you can skim the other ones. You can read their titles, their abstracts, their first and last paragraphs, and you can narrow, and then you can figure out which are the best ones to read, and then read those ones fully and give them the analytical treatment. So the levels of reading work together. For syntopical reading, you need to pick several things. How do you decide which things to read? Through inspectional reading. Once you've decided which things to read, what do? You read them analytically. What do you do when you're done reading them analytically? You take the things you've learned to see what the connections are, and finding those connections, you're doing syntopical reading. So I want to just give you a few notes to wrap up. I want you to end on a cohesive note here. And so how do we make the most of this paradox I just described? I explained how you work with the different levels of reading to pick out the things you're going to read and then read them. So that's one way to make the most of this paradox, but I wanted to give you a few bullet points to take away, to sum up here. So you have to ask the right questions. And what are the right questions? It depends on your goals and your purpose, but almost always to be very specific. Asking questions that are too general won't help you. You won't be able to find anything. You'll end up with War and Peace and Gone with the Wind instead of things that are actually on the same subject. So be specific. Come up with keywords or terms to use when finding research. So when you're looking in search engines like the EW library databases or even something like Google, you don't want to type in your questions because you'll get too many results. So if you take the question and you say, what are some key terms, some key words, you can then plug those into the search. So say, for example, you are researching global warming. You do a little preliminary research online. You figure out you're really interested in the topic of deforestation. It's related to global warming. You might be asking a question like, how are the loss of forests affecting our climates? If you search that in, you're going to get bonkers results. But if you just type in deforestation, you'll get some better results. Read the research syntopically. So this is what we just talked about on the last slide. Once you've got the right questions, once you've used the right terms to find good search results, once you've looked through those search results and figured out which are the best ones, do some inspectional reading, read them analytically, and eventually read them syntopically. Read them closely and then make connections. Now, here's an important transition. These first 3 bullet points were all about the research process and how to find the things you need and start reading them. But once you're done reading them, we make the shift to writing about them. So these first 3 bullet points you could say are on reading, and these final 3 bullet points will be on writing. So after reading the research syntopically, figure out what is missing from the research. What have people not said yet? As you're reading, you'll start to see gaps. You can, as you make the move from reader to writer, can fill in those gaps. And there you may find the answer to the question you've posed at the start of your search. But what do you then do with that answer? Well, you can compose something. You can make your own piece. You can become a writer, not just a reader. So turn your question into a statement, or as we like to call it in my field of study, a thesis. And finally, narrow your statement. Make it more specific. So you have a question. Through the research, you can figure out your answer to that question, what you want to say about the topic. Then you can turn your question into a statement, and you can refine your statement until you have a really good thesis for your paper. And this is how syntopical reading makes you a better writer.